A black single mom, humiliated and mocked by her in-laws on her wedding day, stood silently as whispers filled the room, judging her for her past, her child, and the color of her skin. But what they didn't know was that she held a truth powerful enough to shatter their pride. When a groom took the mic and revealed the secret that tied her to his survival, jaws dropped. And when she calmly exposed who really held power in that room, the entire family was left speechless. What happened next turned shame into awe and made them regret every cruel word. At 34, Jonathan was exhausted, not from the road, but from everything he'd left behind. In Connecticut, he was a respected architect, known for clean lines and elegant designs. But in recent months, the lines of his life had blurred. His engagement had ended abruptly after his fiancé walked away, citing his emotional distance. His father had taken to calling weekly with new reasons why his career path was too safe, why he wasn't taking real risks, why he hadn't settled down and started a family already. Then came the burnout, an invisible weight that sat on his chest, making even the most basic tasks feel insurmountable. So, without telling anyone, Jonathan packed his bags, left his suits behind, and set off on a road trip down south. He wasn't sure what he was chasing, freedom, maybe, or just a reason to breathe again. Either way, he wasn't expecting clarity to come barreling at him in the form of a semi-truck on a blind curve. It happened in an instant. One moment, he was leaning forward to adjust the radio dial. The next, there was screeching rubber, a deafening blast of metal against metal, the sharp crack of glass. And then, nothing. The world went white. When the ambulance arrived, they found Jonathan barely breathing, his ribs crushed, one lung collapsed, and his heart rate plummeting. Strangers had pulled over, called for help, held his hand while waiting for the EMTs. But once he was lifted into the ambulance and rushed down winding roads to the nearest trauma hospital, he was a name no one knew. A man alone, without an emergency contact, still wearing a medical alert bracelet from a childhood allergy no one remembered to check. The ER was bustling that night. Motorcycle crashes, asthma attacks, an overdose in Bay 3, but the moment Naomi Ellis entered Jonathan's room, time seemed to still. Naomi had worked 12-hour shifts before. She had seen more blood, broken bones, and hopeless cases than she could count. But there was something about this one, this quiet, broken man lying alone under fluorescent lights, that stopped her. She wasn't supposed to linger, but she did. She adjusted his oxygen mask. She checked his vitals 3 times. When his eyes fluttered open, dazed and searching, she spoke gently, reassuring him even though he couldn't respond. She wasn't sure why she stayed after her shift ended. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something deeper, a kind of recognition in his silence. Jonathan drifted in and out of consciousness for days. In those moments when the painkillers loosened their grip just enough for him to see the world clearly, he always saw her, this woman with warm eyes, a steady voice, and a strength that made him feel safe in the midst of agony. He didn't know her name. She hadn't given it yet, but she was always there. Naomi brought him water when the nurse on rotation forgot. She smoothed his sheets when he grew restless. Once, when he trembled from a spike in fever, she placed a damp cloth against his forehead and whispered calming words until he stilled. Outside the hospital, life continued as if nothing had changed. Back in Connecticut, Jonathan's family assumed he was still somewhere in Nashville or Savannah, maybe snapping photos of old buildings or sipping whiskey on some hotel rooftop. None of them knew. He hadn't answered their calls before the accident, and now he couldn't. And so, in that hospital room in a small southern city, a man broken in body and spirit met a woman with no obligation to stay. But she did, again and again. Naomi wasn't one to talk about herself. She kept her life compartmentalized, the hospital, her son, the home they shared on the quiet side of town. Widowed at 27, she'd learned quickly how to navigate the world without expecting help. Her late husband, a successful property mogul, had built a real estate empire before passing unexpectedly. She'd taken over the management of his estate, not because she wanted to, but because no one else could. Her days were split between managing complex portfolios and treating trauma wounds. Her nights were filled with homework, bedtime stories, and quiet resilience. No one in that hospital knew about her former life as a property magnate's wife. She didn't share it, not because she was ashamed, but because it wasn't the part of her she needed people to see. She was a nurse now, a mother, a woman rebuilding. And yet, as she sat by Jonathan's bedside night after night, she found herself telling him stories. Not about her husband or her investments, but about her son Eli, about his obsession with dinosaurs, about his off-key rendition of Happy Birthday every time he saw balloons, about the first time he rode a bike and crashed into the mailbox, then got up laughing. Jonathan, still too weak to speak, smiled with his eyes. That was enough. On the sixth day, he opened his mouth and croaked out a single word. Why? Naomi looked at him, puzzled. Why are you here? He rasped. She paused, then answered simply, because you were alone. And that was it. No promises, no expectations, just a truth too rare to ignore. Over the following week, Jonathan regained strength. Naomi began to let the on-duty nurses resume their roles. But the bond had already been forged. When he was strong enough to sit up, he asked for a pen and scribbled something shaky on a napkin. Can I see you again? She laughed when she read it, shaking her head. But she didn't say no. By the time Jonathan was discharged, she'd written her number on the back of his prescription papers. No fanfare, no declarations, just a chance. And while his family continued to think he was basking in Southern hospitality somewhere on a rented beach chair, Jonathan Carter had unknowingly just found the one woman who would teach him what real healing looked like. Not just of the body, but of the heart. The woman who would, years later, walk down the aisle beside him to the shocked stares of the family that never saw her coming. But for now, she simply smiled, waved goodbye, and returned to her son, unaware that her quiet kindness had already rewritten the course of both their lives. Jonathan Carter stood nervously outside the community clinic's back entrance, holding a modest bouquet of white daisies wrapped in brown paper. The last time he had been here, he could barely breathe. Today, he was whole, ribs healed, lungs functioning, but something deeper in him had shifted. His heart beat differently now, not from trauma, but from something he couldn't yet name. Naomi stepped out just as the sun began to dip. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair loosely pulled back, and her eyes, those same eyes that had steadied him in pain, widened with surprise. You tracked me down? She asked, lips tugging into a cautious smile. I owed you more than a thank you, he said, extending the flowers. She looked at them for a moment before taking them gently. You didn't owe me anything. I was just doing my job. Jonathan shook his head. No, you stayed when no one else did. And that's how it began. Their first few dates were simple. Coffee at a corner diner, walks through quiet parks, long conversations in her garage where she'd sit fixing her son's bike while Jonathan asked about her life. She didn't speak much about her late husband, but she talked easily about Eli, her 10-year-old son who dreamed of space and built castles out of cereal boxes. The first time Jonathan met him, Eli eyed him suspiciously and asked, Do you know how to fix a tire? Jonathan didn't, but he crouched next to the boy anyway, got his hands dirty, and let Eli teach him. It earned him a crooked grin and a muttered, You're all right. Over time, Naomi's world became his sanctuary. She cooked with jazz playing in the background. They danced barefoot in her living room on rainy days. On Sundays, Jonathan helped with laundry, sorting socks while Eli made pancakes shaped like rockets. There was no performance, no pressure, just a rhythm that made sense. And so, 2 years after his accident, Jonathan got down on one knee in the same garage where Naomi had once bandaged his swollen ankle during a clumsy attempt to build a treehouse. She looked at the ring, then at him, then whispered, Are you sure? He was, but not everyone celebrated. When he told his family, the phone line went cold. A single mother, his aunt had snapped. She's black, someone else murmured at a family brunch, as if the word itself were a flaw. His father's voice held the most bite. You're Carter. This is not what we expected from you. They didn't ask who she was. They didn't ask what she'd done. They didn't want to know that Naomi had held Jonathan's hand when his body was breaking, or that she taught him how to breathe again, literally and figuratively. Instead, they spun their own version. She's after something. She's using you. She saw a vulnerable man and pounced. The whispers turned into cold shoulders. Invitations to family gatherings stopped arriving. Friends he'd known since childhood gave him polite smiles, but asked loaded questions. Are you sure you want to raise another man's kid? Or what will people say? Jonathan said nothing in return, but inside, a slow-burning fury brewed. Not for himself, but for Naomi, who had never once demanded anything, never once raised her voice in defense. She carried herself with quiet grace, as always. When he told her about the things his family had said, Naomi only nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. I've heard worse, she said softly, brushing her hand across his cheek. But if you want to walk away, I'll understand. Jonathan shook his head, pulling her close. I'm not walking away from the best thing that's ever happened to me. They moved forward with the wedding. And while his family didn't outright refuse to come, their presence arrived with side eyes, tight-lipped smiles, and an air of disdain they didn't bother hiding. They sat stiffly in the pews during the rehearsal, critiqued the venue Naomi had picked, and scoffed when Eli helped fold the ceremony programs. To them, it wasn't a wedding. It was a mistake. But Jonathan saw the truth. He saw a woman who raised a child alone and still had room in her heart for him. A woman who ran her late husband's business while working night shifts to stay grounded. A woman who gave love not for reward, but because it was who she was. He wore his tux with pride, not because of the event, but because of the woman waiting for him at the end of the aisle. And even as whispers lingered behind him, Jonathan stood straighter, steadier, ready for the moment that would change everything. Not just for him, but for every person who dared to doubt what real love looked like. The chapel was wrapped in soft golden light, the kind that makes everything look like a memory in the making. Jonathan Carter stood at the altar, dressed in a tailored navy suit, hands folded, heart steady. He wasn't nervous. He was certain. But behind him, where family should have been smiling, were tight jaws and narrowed eyes. His mother adjusted her pearl necklace with a sigh. His aunt clutched her clutch bag like a lifeline. His cousin leaned in to whisper something that drew a snicker. None of it touched Jonathan. Not anymore. Then the doors opened. Naomi entered, arm in arm with her son, Eli. The music swelled softly as every head turned. She wore a gown of understated elegance, cream satin with lace sleeves, and her natural curls pulled into a soft bun. She didn't smile widely. She didn't need to. She moved like a woman who knew her worth. Eli, in his miniature tuxedo, held her hand like it was sacred. He looked straight ahead, chin up, just like Jonathan had taught him during their practice walks. As Naomi stepped down the aisle, whispers rose like steam. She's pretty, but still. I can't believe you went through with it. A child at a wedding? How tacky. The words were sharp, low, and cowardly. But Naomi didn't flinch. She walked with quiet pride, her eyes focused only on the man waiting for her. Eyes that had seen more pain, more strength, more love than the murmurs behind her would ever comprehend. Jonathan's gaze never left her. When their hands met at the altar, everything else fell away. The murmurs, the glares, the silent protests, none of it mattered, but still existed. From their seats, his relatives stared, not with curiosity, but with offense, as though Naomi's presence disrupted a legacy they had imagined for Jonathan, a future built on sameness, on compliance. Even as the vows began, even as Eli held the rings with trembling hands, the air remained taut with invisible lines drawn between pews and promise. Still, Naomi stood tall, not as someone desperate to be accepted, but as someone who already had everything that mattered: integrity, love, and a son who adored her. She didn't need to fight for approval. She already knew who she was. And Jonathan? He stood with her, unshaken, unashamed, because in that moment, surrounded by polished shoes and bitter hearts, the only truth that mattered was right in front of him, and he was ready to speak it. Jonathan rose slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket. He held the mic for a moment in silence, letting the room settle, eyes scanning across familiar faces. His mother, arms crossed. His uncle, staring down at his plate. His cousin, smirking like he was still in on some joke. Then his gaze shifted to Naomi. Her eyes met his, quiet, encouraging. He smiled, but when he turned back to the crowd, the smile faded. "I want to thank you all for being here today," he began, voice steady but laced with something raw. "Some of you came in celebration. Others came out of obligation." A soft ripple went through the guests, stirring forks, shifting in seats. "But I'm not here to scold anyone," he continued. "I just want to tell a story. Mine. Ours." He paused, letting the words sink in. 3 years ago, I disappeared for a while. You thought I went on vacation. I didn't. Heads tilted, brows furrowed. I was in a car crash on a rural highway in Georgia. Alone. I woke up with broken ribs and a collapsed lung. No phone, no family, no way to call anyone. And no one came looking. I don't blame you, you didn't know. But I nearly died. Gasps. A few mouths opened in disbelief. His mother stiffened in her seat. Jonathan inhaled slowly, his voice deepening. But someone stayed. Someone who didn't know my name, my career, my background. Someone who didn't care about any of that. Naomi. She sat by my bed long after a shift ended. She read to me, fed me iced chips, held my hand when I was too weak to speak. The room was utterly still now. She didn't do it for recognition. She didn't even expect a thank you. She just gave. He looked at his family pointedly now. And when I got better, when I left that hospital with bruised ribs and a grateful heart, I didn't just walk away. I came back with flowers, with questions, and eventually, with a love I never thought I'd deserve. He turned to Naomi again, his voice softening. She didn't need to be anything other than who she is, strong, kind, brilliant, and the best mother I've ever seen. Then he faced the guests again, more resolute. So when you whispered about her being a single mom, when you judged her skin, when you questioned her intentions, understand something. She already saved my life once. And she's been saving it every day since. Silence swallowed the room. A few eyes welled with tears. The smirks were gone. The folded arms had loosened. Jonathan stepped back, handing the mic to the MC. But before sitting, he added one last line, measured and clear. If you still think this woman is beneath me, then I invite you to leave. Because I won't spend one more minute defending her to anyone who can't see what she's worth. He sat. Naomi reached for his hand, squeezing it softly. Across the room, his mother looked down, ashamed, her lips trembling but silent. And the ballroom remained hushed. Not because of discomfort, but because truth had finally been spoken. The tension in the ballroom was already thick when Naomi stood up. But the silence that followed her rise was something else entirely. Hushed, alert, waiting. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped forward in her flowing ivory gown, her posture as poised as a queen, her expression calm, measured, and unshaken. Beside her, Jonathan remained seated, his gaze steady on her as she gently took the microphone from the MC's hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear enough to carry to every corner of the room. She turned to face Jonathan's family directly. Her tone was not confrontational. There was no bitterness, no anger, but there was unmistakable weight in every word. "I know many of you don't approve of me," she began. "You've whispered, judged, even mocked. Because I'm a single mom. Because I'm black. Because you think I don't belong in your family." Some faces shifted. A few looked away. "But before you make any more assumptions, let me tell you something you didn't know." She took a breath, then dropped the truth with the force of quiet thunder. "I was married. My late husband built one of the most successful property portfolios in this state. After his passing, I became the managing trustee of his entire estate." The room stilled. Utensils froze midair. Someone gasped aloud. Naomi's eyes swept the audience with calm authority. "Some of you here today, you live in those properties." A wave of murmurs moved like a ripple through the seated guests. Naomi paused, allowing the moment to land. "You've been behind on rent for months, she said plainly. Delinquent. Technically subject to eviction. There was no venom in her words, only truth. Her grace remained intact, even as jaws dropped and faces flushed in disbelief. But I never acted on that, she continued, because I knew who you were, and because I loved Jonathan. She turned toward her husband, a soft smile playing at the edges of her lips. I knew what kind of burden it would place on him, to be caught between the woman he loves and the family who refuses to see her clearly. Then she faced the crowd once more. So I chose grace. I chose dignity. I chose to quietly bear your disdain while still ensuring you had a roof over your heads. Her voice didn't waver, not once. I didn't want to embarrass you. I didn't want to shame anyone. That's not who I am. Eyes welled. Some covered their mouths. Others bowed their heads. I came into this marriage not to take anything from anyone, Naomi said, but to add love, to build a life with a man who saw me, truly saw me, when it mattered most. She handed the microphone back with quiet finality and stepped down, returning to her seat beside Jonathan, who reached for her hand and kissed it gently. No applause. Not yet. Only the weight of truth crashing through pride like glass. And for the first time that evening, there wasn't a single whisper. Only stunned silence and the beginning of regret. The weight of Naomi's words hung in the air long after she returned to her seat beside Jonathan. The clinking of glasses, the laughter, even the music had faded into an uncomfortable hush. In that stillness, Jonathan's family was left staring at a mirror they had long avoided, one that reflected not just their ignorance, but their prejudice. For the first time, they truly saw her, not as a black single mom, not as someone beneath them, but as the woman who had saved their son's life, built a life of her own, and offered them grace even when they gave her cruelty in return. Jonathan's aunt, one of the more outspoken critics, was the first to rise. Her eyes were wet, her posture uncertain, but she crossed the room with slow determination. She reached Naomi's table, trembling. I didn't know, she whispered. And that's no excuse. I was wrong. So wrong. Naomi stood, offered her hand, but the woman reached instead for a hug. Naomi embraced her, soft and steady, just as she had done for Jonathan all those months ago in the hospital. One by one, the others followed. Cousins who had whispered behind menus at rehearsal dinners. An uncle who had scoffed and refused to RSVP. Even Jonathan's older brother, who had once pulled him aside and said, "Don't throw your life away on someone like her," approached with red eyes and a cracked voice. "I judged you before I ever tried to know you," he admitted. "I am sorry." Truly, Naomi met every apology the same way she had met Jonathan's pain that night in the ER, with quiet compassion, never asking for anything, but giving everything. By the time the reception music resumed, something had shifted. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. It had become a reckoning. And for Jonathan's family, it was more than a lesson. It was a transformation. Because in Naomi, they didn't just gain a daughter-in-law. They witnessed what strength looked like when it wore kindness. What class looked like without a designer label. What power looked like when it chose grace instead of revenge. And for the rest of their lives, none of them would forget the woman they once underestimated, and the day she made them better just by standing tall. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.